Okay, after some audio problems last week, I kind of started looking around at how I've been doing this, and I don't watch on my phone very often. Usually I'm on my computer or on my TV, and I watched one of my own Writing with James things on my phone, and particularly that one I did last week, you couldn't hear nothing I was saying. And so, even though it's not always a problem, I don't think, it's kind of pointless if you can't hear what I'm saying. So maybe we'll just try something a little different, doing the voiceover thing, because the whole point of it is that you get to see some of the countryside, you get to see where I'm going. I guess you don't really need the car noises, do you? And it'll probably be a little bit easier for me to edit too. I won't have so many breaks in the video. I became fascinated with the bird poo on the windshield there, because I didn't know it was didn't even realize it was there when I started doing this. But we're gonna try this different way of doing things for the all important topic of professional wrestling. I've actually kind of been getting into wrestling again recently, and it's something that seems to pop up about every 10 years. Because we're going back to, I was a wrestling fan back in the early and mid 80s. I kind of started getting into it right before the big explosion in the 80s. I was primarily a World Class fan, which was the Dallas-based NWA territory with the Von Erichs and the Freebirds and Bruiser Brody, Jim Garvin, Chris Adams, that crew. But where I lived, we actually got a lot of different wrestling. We got the Georgia Championship Wrestling out of on TBS, which a few years down the road, a lot of people don't even realize this, the WWF actually took over that time slot. Vince McMahon bought that time slot and ran the NWA out. They call that Black Saturday, because the NWA fans sat down to watch their usual Georgia wrestling, and there's Vince McMahon. And most of them didn't like it. I know I didn't particularly care for it, but the Georgia territory, they actually got a time slot early on Saturday morning, and this was Ole Anderson, Ronnie Garvin, Ted DiBiase. I think Tommy Rich was still around there at the time. That group of people. They were on early in the morning. Then you had the WWF, which we're talking Hulk. This is at the peak of Hulk Hogan's popularity, and Roddy Piper and that group. Like I say, I'd watch it because it was there, but I didn't really like it that much. World Class Wrestling on Saturday night, and then TBS started running MidSouth Wrestling on Sunday as well, which this was Magnum TA. It seems like such a silly name now. His name was Terry Allen, but he kind of had a vague resemblance to Tom Selleck, so they called him Magnum TA. Oh, who else was in that territory? Jim Duggan, Terry Taylor. It was pretty good. And then, of course, ESPN was running AWA stuff there for a while, which was the Minnesota-based, Vern Gagne's Minnesota-based American Wrestling Alliance, which Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, guys like that. So basically, all weekend long, you could sit there and watch wrestling. And I can remember sitting there one Saturday night as World Class Wrestling was coming on. I can't remember exactly when this was, but it was right before, I think just as the USWA stuff was starting to happen, or just right before it started to happen, the World Class Wrestling, what do you call it? They combined with the Memphis territory, and it ended up creating the USWA. Right, just as all that was happening. Of course, David had died. David Von Erich had died a few years before that. Mike Von Erich had passed away. Kerry was in a motorcycle accident, and he had been gone. Kevin was still there, but he really wasn't on TV that much. And of course, the Freebirds were gone, and Jim Garvin and Chris Adams were gone, and Johnny Mantell wasn't around anymore. And, it was guys like Al Perez and Matt Bourne, and a lot of guys I really just wasn't that interested in. But one guy that was coming up was a guy named Steve Austin. Steve Austin actually started off in the World Class. I remember when he first came in, but I was really starting to lose interest. And of course, my interest in wrestling centered on World Class. So when I was going to lose interest in it, the rest of it was soon to fall. And I can remember sitting there one night, and Mark Lawrence, I didn't get the Dallas shows. I got the shows out of Fort Worth. And Mark Lawrence was going over the card, and I just kind of sat there and I thought, I wonder what's on Saturday Night Live. And I switched over, and I just never switched back. And I'd catch a little bit about wrestling here and there over the years, but for the most part, I didn't really watch it. I remember sitting at a place in Gainesville, and some wrestling came on TV, and that's how I found out Hulk Hogan had become a bad guy, become Hollywood Hulk Hogan. But it wasn't until Goldberg, when Goldberg came along, and some friends of mine did watch the WCW stuff, and I kind of looked at Goldberg, and I was like, man, he looks like he could actually just really beat the crap out of somebody. He looks like one of those guys that looks like he's as tough as they're playing him up to be. And so I started watching a little bit again. I got into it for a couple of years. So it only lasted, I'd say, about 2 or 3 years, maybe. I do remember I was taping Nitro, and it got to the point I'd come home and I'd fast forward through a bunch of stuff until I'd see Torrie Wilson, and then I'd stop and I'd watch Torrie Wilson's part, and then I'd go back to fast forward, and I finally figured out, okay, this is pointless. I'm not even watching the stuff, and I stopped taping it. And then wrestling was gone again for a while, and it's kind of odd how my interest was revived, because I had been watching a little bit of stuff on YouTube, because I never did get into the WWF, WWE. But some kids, friends of mine, would watch it back when Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and all those guys were the top stars. And so I catch a little bit about it here and there. And I did kind of like The Rock because I thought he was funny. And of course, Stone Cold Steve Austin, there's a little bit of sentimentality there. He's a Texas guy, went to North Texas University right there in Denton. And so I was watching, but I didn't really ever watch it. And I started watching more recently these little YouTube videos from back then, and found myself feeling nostalgic about stuff I never watched in the first place, because those were kind of the last link to the old school wrestling. Steve Austin and The Rock and Shawn Michaels and guys like that, the guys that actually were really good at what they did. And but then when and some of the people in our circle will know what I'm talking about here, the fake Finn Balor. When he was coming into the live streams, and he made the claim that, we asked him, okay, well, if you're really Finn Balor, you need to give us a shout out on TV. And he said, well, WWE won't let us give a shout out. And said, well, do something. Just, wink at the camera or tug on your earlobe or something, and we'll know that's for us. I said, okay, well, I'll do the wink. And then he left. Well, I watched Raw that Monday to see if Finn Balor winked, and of course he didn't wink. And of course he was fully busted as a phony, which is probably just some 12-year-old kid role playing. I watched that night, and I was like, what? This doesn't completely suck. So I'd start watching some highlights and stuff on YouTube, and I still had my problems with some of it. There's only so many times you can, 8 Superman punches in a match, and 5 curb stomps, and finishes aren't finishes anymore, and they don't finish anything. But what really started capturing my attention was the women's division. I think the women they have there are actually really good. Leading up, I started watching again, and of course, some of them were quite eye-catching. But the Charlotte Flair, I'm still learning the names. Osuna, their match at WrestleMania 34, that was an outstanding match. Part of pro wrestling is just like any other TV show in a way. It's predetermined, You know that the winner is chosen, but there has to be that base of believability. Just like, The Walking Dead. You know there's no zombie apocalypse. You know Andrew Lincoln isn't really a sheriff from Georgia. But there's got to be a center of believability and reality. And I thought that Charlotte Flair match at WrestleMania really signified that center of believability. You believed that they just left everything in the ring. That they wore each other out, that they were exhausted at the end of it, that it really was the toughest battle that Charlotte Flair had ever had. And then, of course, the Nia Jax Alexa Bliss match. I kind of liked it was like a role reversal. It was bullying, but it was mental bullying. It was the big girl being bullied by the little 5-foot prissy girl. Nia Jax just grabbing Alexa Bliss and just throwing her around like a rag doll. And at one point, Alexa Bliss got slammed onto the mat, and it's just like, oh my God! I mean, she got slammed so hard. It was just like, my God, you just expected her innards to come up out of her mouth or something. It was just so vicious looking. And then plus the women have been doing actual wrestling moves. I've seen the abdominal stretch in women's matches. I've seen the Boston Crab in women's matches. It's not like the women wrestling back in the 80s when it was basically all body slams and hair pulls. They're actually wrestling, and you can believe that they're actually pissed at each other. And while some of the men do a pretty good job, which I gotta say this, one of my biggest problems with current WWE is the fans. They're just, get off Roman Reigns' back, for crying out loud. The guy goes out, he's really good in the ring, not the greatest talker in the world, but I think he's really good at what he does in the ring. And just the fact that he walks out there every week knowing that 3/4 of that stadium is going to be booing him, and the only reason they're booing him is because they're butthurt over stuff that happened 2 and 3 years ago because, the WWE pushed him instead of the guy they wanted. Just get over it already. I mean, at least give the guy some respect for walking out there and just dealing with that stuff. Yeah, I guess that's just mostly my thought on it is it's not it doesn't suck as bad as it used to. I'm actually interested again. I don't know how long the interest is going to last. It might be a couple of weeks, might be a couple of years, but I am watching it a bit here and there, and like I say, we'll just have to wait and see how long this lasts. And let me know what you think about doing it this way. I know the first writing with James I did basically this way. It was just a voiceover. Is this decent this way? Still get a decent view. I promise there won't be as much bird poo on the windshield as there. But just let me know what you think. If you're new, click that one-way sign in the corner to subscribe. Click the circle at the end to subscribe. You can red button on the front of the channel to subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, especially if you're not a wrestling fan, thanks for watching till the very end. And I'll see you next time.